Hello, and you're listening to a preview of Pulse Check, an exclusive podcast for Quwa Plus and Quwa Pro subscribers. If you are interested in listening to the full episode, then go to quwa.org/plus to subscribe and access this episode and all others. Thank you, and enjoy the preview. So for this episode of Pulse Check, I have with me Dr. Mansoor Ahmed, honorary lecturer at the Strategic and Defense Studies Center at the Australian National University in Canberra, and above all, author of the book, Pakistan's Pathway to the Bomb, a highly detailed, meticulously documented and sourced account of Pakistan's nuclear program. Hi, Mansoor. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you for having me.
No worries, and thank you for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you. I've been really waiting for this episode for a while. So as you know, with Pulse Check, since we discussed this earlier, is I present a bit of a thesis to you, a bit of a take, and then from there, we lean on your expertise to sort of unpack, correct, and build on it. So, Mansoor, after reading your book, the thesis I have for you is this, and it might not be so much as a thesis because it's really a reflection of what you have written, but maybe it's a bit of a take, a bit of a perspective based on that. So since the nuclear detonation tests of May 1998, I think the prevailing narrative we're fed, both from outside and to an extent even within, is that the Pakistani nuclear program was one of purely acquiring weapons. It was an effort comprising of a mix of illicit acquisition-oriented activities, direct help from China, and a narrow pool of personalities that led to a very specific outcome: weapons. In contrast, the narrative is that India's nuclear program was this far wider, broadly encompassing, rules-driven effort aimed at energy that, as a consequence of India's technology advances, led to weapons. So there's this inherent sense that India had an entitlement to the nuclear weapon stack, whereas Pakistan did not, because Pakistan took this supposedly illicit approach. However, the reality, especially after reading your book and even Brigadier Feroz Khan's Eating Grass, is that in truth, Pakistan's nuclear program was no less scientifically grounded. In fact, Pakistan also developed, as you documented and discussed in immense detail, and I think you're the voice on this, the entire nuclear fuel cycle indigenously. And to do so, it built, thanks to a persistence across several leaderships, the industrial and technological ecosystem to achieve it. And that aspect of its history, and even the present of its status today, is overlooked and dismissed. And I argue all that is happening due to a lack of knowledge of the actual facts. Finally, my argument is that if given the same policy level persistence and investment, Pakistan could also build analogous scientific, technological, and industrial foundations as it had in nuclear in many other areas, from aerospace to metallurgy, you name it. And I think the country, if one understands the depth of the nuclear program as a whole, can see that all the ingredients to become an adept industrial middle power that can partner with other countries like Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Poland, you name it, Brazil, it's all there. It has everything it needs. It just lacks that decades-long policy persistence that somehow existed across different leaderships, different personalities, different people, and the system that was led by the Pakistan Atomic Energy Commission to drive it. And that is, I'll leave it to you from there.
Thank you so much. Well, Pakistan's program has been characterized for all the wrong reasons through the lens of illicit procurement. And I would frame Pakistan's nuclear development over the past 6 to 7 decades around 3 R's: resolve, to acquire technology, and to defy technological denials and sanctions; resilience, in seeking to master the fuel cycle, the weapons program, and application of atomic energy for peaceful purposes, coupled with a lot of restraint and responsibility as a state actor, which has largely gone unnoticed. Pakistan doesn't really get a lot of credit for being responsible throughout its nuclear journey. So it'll be useful to actually, begin revisiting the journey through from the 1960s onwards, and then chronologically look at the different phases of the country's development of atomic energy. So Pakistan essentially created the Atomic Energy Commission in response to the US Atoms for Peace program that was unveiled by President Eisenhower in the early 50s. And as part of that program, a committee was set up known as the Pakistan Atomic Energy Committee that around 1954 and 55, and then they sent a small delegation to the first Geneva conference on the peaceful uses of atomic energy in 55, which then ultimately led to the creation of the PAEC in 1956. So the first chairman was Dr. Nazir Ahmed, and he didn't really have a lot of autonomy because it was a nascent organization. The main scientist along with Dr. Nazir was Professor Abdul Salam at that time. And he brought in Dr. I.H. Usmani, who was another leading physicist at the time, who was working in the civil service as member of PAC. And it was Salam who eventually convinced Usmani to take over the Pakistan Atomic Energy Commission and lobbied for him with President Ayub Khan in 1960 as well. So Usmani was appointed as chairman PAC in 1960, served for 12 years until 72. So between 1956 and 1972, the program was essentially driven by the need to harness the peaceful atom, specifically for research and development around a research reactor at PINSTECH, also known as the Pakistan Institute of Nuclear Science and Technology. This was primarily driven by Salam and Usmani, and it was the building itself was designed by an American architect, Edward Durrell Stone, and the 5-megawatt research reactor was also built by an American firm, AMF Atomics, and the United States agreed to provide highly enriched uranium under safeguards for the 5-megawatt research reactor. So the purpose was to train manpower and build a critical mass of a workforce to start a civilian nuclear energy program. And at the same time, Pakistan entered into an agreement with Canada for the supply of 137 megawatt CANDU type heavy water power reactor, which came to be known as CANUP, the Karachi Nuclear Power Plant. But before we proceed further, it would be useful to just go back a bit and look at the impact of Atoms for Peace, the long-term strategic impact. So Atoms for Peace was essentially designed to open the gates of the peaceful use of the atom to several developing countries. And this was kind of part of the US-led geostrategic outreach for countering Soviet influence throughout the Third World. And the Soviets then, they also launched their own version of Atoms for Peace, under which they supplied technology to the People's Republic of China and also North Korea. So a major contribution of Atoms for Peace was that it opened up the gates of American nuclear laboratories and universities to scientists and engineers in the field of nuclear science and technology, both engineering and physics. And Pakistan was able to send around 500 scientists and engineers between 1955-56 up until the mid-1960s in different fields, both in not only in the United States, but also in Canada, in the UK, and other European establishments. And the United States, they established several reactor schools, one of which was the Argonne International School of Nuclear Science and Engineering, and others as well. And this allowed the Pakistani Atomic Energy Commission to gain access to the latest unclassified facilities in order to train manpower in various aspects of atomic energy. So the critical bottleneck for the program in the beginning was to set up a cadre of well-educated and trained scientists and engineers in different aspects. And this was the crowning achievement in the first 15 years of the program, along with the setting up of the 5-megawatt research reactor. So many of them, they came back to Pakistan, and it was still a united Pakistan. And half of the trained workforce consisted of Bengali engineers and scientists. And many of them then chose to leave Pakistan for Bangladesh after the 1971 war. The other important achievement during this time was that Pakistan started looking at India's program from a security lens. And at this juncture, the significance of a coalition of like-minded scientists and engineers came to the fore, because, of course, Sanam was there as member of the PAC. He was advisor to the president on science and technology. Dr. Usmani was chairman of PAC, and they were consistently striving for funding and resources to expand the civilian program. But they were not the only ones. There was, of course, a young Pakistani politician, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, who was Minister of Industries and Production, and later also in charge of atomic energy affairs, and then later on foreign minister. And as early as March 1965. In fact, on 11th of March 1965, his interview was published in the Manchester Guardian, in which he made the famous statement about that Pakistan will have to eat grass, but will get an atom bomb of its own, and there is no other alternative. And that was, of course, in response to the understanding that India had a much more developed program and was pursuing the nuclear option. So there was this domestic coalition of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto and Usmani and Salam. But then there was another Pakistani engineer who was working in the International Atomic Energy Agency at that time, who, along with Dr. Abdul Qadir Khan, would play the most significant part in Pakistan's emergence as a nuclear weapon state. So he then moved to Argonne and was part of the third batch of nuclear engineering trainees, along with Muhammad Yusuf, who was another Pakistani engineer who was trained at Argonne at that time. And then Munir Khan also worked as a reactor design engineer at Argonne National Labs and the AMF Atomics, which was the same company that had designed the 5-megawatt research reactor for Pakistan. And thereafter, he joined the International Atomic Energy Agency. He was the first Asian who was appointed to a senior technical post in professional grade P5 in 1958, and eventually he rose to the position of as head of reactor engineering and fuel cycle activities as senior officer until 1972. So Munir Khan had the opportunity to visit India's nuclear research complex at Trombay in 1964. There was a research reactor utilization conference sponsored by the IAEA, and he was part of the delegation. In fact, there is a photo of him sitting on the stage as scientific secretary, along with Dr. Homi Jahangir Baba at the time. And then he was able to visit some of the facilities, including the reprocessing plant and the research reactor, the Cyrus research reactor, which became the source of the weapons-grade plutonium that was used in India's 1974 test. And when he came back from that visit, so he wrote to tried to contact President Ayub Khan, and President Ayub Khan said, I don't know much about these atom bombs, so I'm sending my foreign minister, who was Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. So they had already met in the United Nations several years before, and then Zulfikar Ali Bhutto went to Vienna and met Munir Khan at the Imperial Hotel in October of 65. So Munir's argument was that, look, you cannot win a conventional war against India. Pakistan will be at a perpetual disadvantage, and the only path forward to secure Pakistan's future defense requirements was to acquire a deterrent. So Zulfikar Ali Bhutto was already convinced of the need to acquire a deterrent. And then he promised to facilitate a meeting with the president. So the president at that time, Ayub Khan, he was visiting London, and then he was able to see Munir Khan on 11th of December at the Rochester Hotel. And so he was coming back from a meeting with President Johnson, and probably he wasn't really in a very good mood. But nevertheless, he listened patiently to Munir Khan's. The proposal was that Pakistan should be able to acquire the nuclear fuel cycle facilities while they were still available outside safeguards, and there were no restrictions attached, and the total cost estimate at that time this was a natural uranium fuel cycle. The total cost estimate was only $150 million. But Ayub Khan listened patiently, but then he said, well, Pakistan is too poor a country to afford such luxuries, and if we ever need the bomb, we'll buy it off the shelf from a friendly country. And then the meeting was then reported to Bhutto, and Bhutto made a remark that don't worry, our turn will come. So then came in Tashkent in January of 66, and thereafter Bhutto resigned as foreign minister. So Munir then wrote to Bhutto and asked him to visit Vienna with his family, and they stayed at his place in Vienna and then that started the journey of a friendship, which he would later describe as similar to a Nehru-Bhabha-like alliance. So this was part of those were two parallel coalitions, and both the coalitions involved Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, both within Pakistan and outside Pakistan. But then Usmani and Salam and Munir Khan were all also well known, because Usmani would visit the IAEA regularly as chairman of PAEC to attend the general conferences, and Salam was still advisor to the president. But besides these coalitions within Pakistan's establishment, there were others along with Bhutto, such as Agha Shahi, who were pushing for a deterrent. And there were also efforts regarding the establishment of CANAP that would not have been possible without the personal interest and the support that was accorded to the project by Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, because there were competing interests between the very strong bureaucracy at that time, and this nuclear lobby, so to speak. And the interests were essentially aimed at the most efficient allocation of resources, because of course resources were not finite, were not infinite, and they were still other competing projects such as hydroelectric dams, etc. And Pakistan was also part of the Western Alliance system at that time. So there was many people who believed that the nuclear deterrent was kind of a luxury at that time. Nevertheless, efforts by Salam and Usmani to convince Ayub Khan and then subsequently President Yahya Khan did not bear any fruit. But during this time, essentially, PINSTECH was still under construction. The 5-megawatt Pakistan atomic research reactor that went critical in December of 1965. And some of the scientists and engineers who were being trained in the West, they started coming back to join the Atomic Energy Commission. And then those young scientists and engineers, they formed the kind of another parallel coalition of nuclear enthusiasts, because they had seen the potential of atomic energy in the West. They had seen that this technology was dual use. It could be used for generating power. It could be used in agriculture and medicine, but it could also be used to develop a nuclear deterrent capability. So the presence of these coalitions, the emerging threat that was being perceived by the nuclear elites, including Usmani and Salam and Munir Khan and Bhutto, that created an enabling environment to generate a lot of momentum and demand for deterrent capability. And at this point in time, it will be useful to give credit to the Pakistani Foreign Office and other decision makers that they chose not to sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which was still being negotiated. The draft was being finalized. It went into force in 1970, and that, coupled with the fact that these nuclear enthusiasts, they were looking at India's developments from a security lens, that helped secure Pakistan's long-term strategic interests. So the other important factor was that the Indians they had already started talking about working on so-called peaceful nuclear explosives. And in the fourth Geneva Conference on the Peaceful Uses of Atomic Energy in September 71, for example, the chairman of India's Atomic Energy Commission was Dr. Vikram Sarabhai, and he, on record, stated that they were working on peaceful nuclear explosions. And Dr. Usmani was there as chairman of PAEC. Munir Ahmed Khan was there as one of the scientific secretaries of that Geneva conference. And they, of course, noted this statement. And it was brought to the notice of Canada because the Canadians had supplied the Cyrus reactor. And of course, then there were parallel developments that were happening within Pakistan. In 1971, December, of course, there was the separation of East Pakistan. And within a few days of 16th of December, 71, there was a large procession taken out by these young enthusiasts from PINSTECH, and they made fiery speeches, and they said that if we would have had a bomb, then Pakistan could never have been dismembered. But Bhutto was appointed within 4 days of that event on the 20th of December as the Chief Martial Law Administrator and President. And the first thing that he did as the country's chief executive was to summon a meeting of the top scientists and engineers in Multan. Originally, it was scheduled to take place in Quetta, but then due to inclement weather, it was shifted to Multan. And he gathered all the top scientists and engineers from within Pakistan, from outside Pakistan, and that meeting took place in the mansion of the Nawab Sadiq Hussain Qureshi in Multan. And there, the purpose of the meeting was to essentially take stock of the status of the program and to gauge the mood of the scientists and engineers. And it was designed to throw a challenge before Pakistan's newly trained cadre of scientists and engineers who were beneficiaries of Atoms for Peace, if they could take up the challenge to build a deterrent program. So at that meeting, Bhutto also announced some organizational changes to the structure of the Atomic Energy Commission. He said that I am making fundamental changes to the structure of the PAEC. Dr. Ayush Usmani is being made Secretary Science and Technology, and I brought in a young nuclear engineer from the IAEA, Munir Ahmad Khan, who will hereby be the new chairman of the commission. Now, Usmani was cognizant of the challenges that Pakistan would have to face if it were to go down the path to building nuclear weapons. And he believed that the lack of the infrastructure, the lack of sufficient trained manpower, now at that point in time, half of the trained manpower that Pakistan was able to harness through Atoms for Peace had left for Bangladesh. So the total number of scientists, engineers, technicians available to Pakistan to start a program from scratch, a weapons program from scratch, was 283. So Usmani took a principled position and he said that one has to be realistic. And eventually, Usmani was kind of promoted to the position of Secretary Science and Technology, which was a new position. It was technically a promotion, but it was also a removal from the position of Chairman PAEC. And he had also had a falling out with Zulfikar Ali Bhutto and other leaders of the Pakistan People's Party from his days, such as J.A. Rahim, one of the senior leaders of the Pakistan People's Party, because they had probably served together at some point in the civil service. So Usmani was removed and a new structure was created whereby the chairman of PAC would now report directly to the president or the prime minister, whoever was the chief executive. So this was a major shift, and he also gave a blank check to the nuclear establishment in terms of access to financial resources. So red tape was essentially eliminated. And then Munir Khan went back to Vienna and he sent a note to Bhutto that I will only join if the position of chairman of PAC will be equal in status to the secretary of the federal government. Because before that, the position was reporting to a joint secretary in the Ministry of Industries. So that was a fundamental change that was brought about by President Bhutto at that time. And in March of 72, Usmani eventually handed over the charge to the new chairman. So the first task before the new leadership was to prepare a long-term nuclear plan and a roadmap of acquiring a deterrent capability. Now here, it's important to understand that different countries pursue different pathways to acquiring a nuclear deterrent. There are different drivers that propel decisions eventually resulting in nuclear capability. And from a theoretical lens, of course, there is always the security driver that is paramount, especially for countries like Pakistan. And in this case, of course, the security perceptions, the threat perceptions that were emanating from India's nuclear developments, they were fueling strategic anxieties, both within the Pakistan strategic elite and amongst the young scientists and engineers who had been trained in the West, the so-called bomb lobby. So the security driver, however, was paramount. But in order to translate that capability into an actionable program that was also sustainable to the point where the country would eventually acquire a deterrent, that eventually depended on the coalition of nuclear myth makers and nuclear nationalists. So that coalition, consisting of the right people at the right time, was critical to start and to sustain a weapons program. There have been several other cases where there was an external security threat that was considered as existential. For example, Egypt in the 1960s, there was Taiwan at one point, there was Iraq at one point, and none of these countries, and probably Libya also, none of these countries could start and sustain a weapons program and bring it to its logical conclusion because the right coalition of like-minded scientists, engineers, politicians, technocrats was not available. That was necessary to generate the political support and consensus for such a program. And in this case, in Pakistan was fortunate because the right coalition existed in January of 1972, consisting of enthusiastic scientists and engineers within the Atomic Energy Commission and the coalition between Zulfikar Ali Bhutto and Munir Ahmed.
And that concludes this episode's preview. If you are interested in listening to the full episode and getting much more, then be sure to subscribe to Quwa Plus. It gives you access to all of our Pulse Check episodes, as well as our vast library and archives of past content. And up-to-date analyses and defense news coverage on Pakistan and much more. Thank you, take care, and bye.